And Sean, let me just quickly introduce you and welcome you to our event. You are the Director of Supply Chain at the Manufacturing Technology Center in the UK and also Visiting Fellow at Cranfield University School of Management. You have 26 years of global experience across diverse industries. You held roles including strategic advisor to the United Nations. You are a client partner at Era Technology, founder, CEO of 7 consultancy, just to name a few. Very impressive. And for sure, you are also known as an accomplished keynote speaker, Sean, and author of Disruptive Technologies and Supply Chain Innovation. And I think that's the role you will take for us today. So, Sean, over to you for our first speech today.
Thank you, Bjorn, and good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be with you. I've got quite a intensive, quite a long presentation for you that I'm trying to cram into a very short period of time today. So I hope you can stick with me because I'm going to cover quite a bit of information here. I'm going to start by, apologies. I'm going to start by a really positive message, looking across, the wider external factors and internal factors. And we can find ourselves living in a time of quite significant fragility right now. Most people's personal finances are feeling a bit fragile. I know most people are sort of waiting with sort of bated breath to see what Chancellor comes up with at the end of this month. Most supply chains feel particularly fragile. Energy and food supply seem fragile. Economies are fragile. With all the war going on across Ukraine, with the issues out with Taiwan and China, our peace feels particularly fragile. Our democracies right now feel particularly fragile, and our ecosystems feel fragile. So it doesn't feel like a particularly great time at this moment in time. So it's not unexpected that people are getting a little bit concerned about what's going on. And interestingly, as we've increasingly embraced technology, specifically digital technology, what we're finding is that, this is creating the potential of systemic collapse. So, for example, there's a couple of examples here. One is that the single source of most of the quartz required to make crucibles that make silicon valley wafers only exists in one particular mine, which is very much exposed to issue. Another one actually is the fact that the entire internet seems to be based around a number of data centers, and we very recently had the AWS outage across the US East region, which seemed to take down half the internet. So as we become more digitized, that fragility seems to have been accelerated. So, of course, you'd hear all that and you'd be quite concerned, and you say, well, do you think we're doomed? And the answer is no. There's no reason to particularly think that. We've been here before. And in fact, we've been at this particular point 5 times previously. And in fact, if we look at what we call chondria waves, these are waves of technological innovation that have taken place ever since the Industrial Revolution, you will see that there's been 5 of these before. Each one is being sort of predicated around real innovations in power, in transportation, in communication, that when converged together create revolutions in industry, what we call creative destruction, which was named after Joseph Schumpeter, the Austrian economist. It's basically, as these new innovations create new industries, they cause the destruction of the old industries that were wedded to the old paradigms. And the reason why we're going through all this fragility right now is that in the upswing period, which makes up about 65% of each wave, there is a transitional point in the middle, something called, which Carlota Perez, who's from the London School of Economics, calls the turning point. And this is where things get particularly hairy. It's where there's lots of power structures between the old paradigms and the new paradigms, between the old geopolitical power structures and the new ones. And just because we're experiencing it for the first time, it doesn't mean it's new. So just because it's new to us doesn't mean it's new. And if we go back to this particular point in the previous wave, you can see the headlines that are very similar to the headlines that we're going for right now. Fuel price issues, major issues regarding social unrests, conflicts, all of these things were happening at exactly this point in the previous wave. And for those of you who lived through the sort of late 1970s, early 1980s, you will remember that. So we saw these headlines before, but we got through it. So while events might look like the recent past, they do look like the long-term past, such is the nature of cycles. And this upswing period, which, as I said, takes up between sort of 60 to 65% of the sort of experimental entrepreneurial stage of these technological cycles, has two phases. The first phase really is about using new tools to do old things in new ways. And the second phase is where we actually look at these inventions and turn them into innovations that ultimately become industrialized. So using new tools to do entirely new things and the reimagining how things are done. And that's kind of where the real transformation happens. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples, if I may. So if we go all the way back to the first wave of the first industrial revolution, Thomas Newcomen invented an atmospheric engine that no one really particularly used. James Watt picked that up and improved upon it in 1779. But the major use of that was to extract more water from coal mines so that people can dig deeper and extract more coal. That was an efficiency saving. However, the real transformation happened when actually we took that engine, put it on top of a truck, put the truck on top of a tracks, and now we've got a transportation revolution. So that was a completely new way of moving people around that didn't happen before. That was the real revolution that came from the steam engine, and of course the powering of factories as well. Then in the third wave, Benz created the motor vehicle. And it wasn't until, sorry, apologies. Can you get rid of that and I've lost my presentation?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
My apologies, technical issues. So it was only when the transportation revolution happens, when Henry Ford came up with the assembly line, that was actually what caused the transportation revolution. So the invention happened 20, 30 years earlier, but it was only in the second phase that we actually had a revolution. And the thing to look forward to, the positive note, is each one of these second phases has led us to a technological golden age. At the Industrial Revolution, we had the golden age of canals and industry. Then we moved to the golden age of rail and steam. In the third wave, we had the Victorian golden age. Then we moved to the Roaring '20s. And then finally into Pax Americana in the golden age of telecom and commuting. Now, we're looking at a digital golden age moving forward, so sort of age of artificial intelligence, robotics, and the Internet of everything. Now, one of the laws I really want to focus on here, because it's something I think that really helps people to understand the nature of the change and we're going through, specifically technological driven change, is something called Amara's law. And Amara's law is basically that we tend to overestimate the impact of technology in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. And this was something that certainly I fell foul of myself, if I can be perfectly honest. When I was writing my book Transition Point, we were in the sort of early 2010s, we were looking at things like autonomous vehicles, for example, and thinking that certainly by the end of the decade, I could imagine that we would be driving around in autonomous vehicles and then become quite disillusioned when, by 2020, we hadn't seen that. But that doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It just means that we overestimated its impact in the early stage when it was an invention. But we tend to then underestimate what the real impact when it becomes fully materialized, industrialized, and changes the way we do things. So creative destruction phase one, we tend to overestimate the impact, goes into the trough of disillusionment, and then we have phase two, where we're really surprised about the real impact that these technologies have. And we're here at the moment, we're right at that midpoint. That transitional period is at that midpoint where there's a battle between the sort of old paradigm and the new paradigm. The speed of change, once that occurs, is phenomenal. And I just want to use this as a particular example. So if we go back to 1908 in the third wave, if you look at Fifth Avenue in New York, you can see that everyone is moving around either on foot power or horsepower. However, just 5 years later, and then you look at this picture and you can see that there's motor cars up and down Fifth Avenue. In fact, there's only one laggard in the middle there who's still in his horse and carriage. Now, imagine going through that transformation where you've never seen motor cars before to suddenly, the entire street is full of them. That's a real transformation. And that's the speed of change that takes place once this tipping point occurs. And we can see a lot of technologies that we thought were going to be really disruptive in the first phase of the sixth wave, but we haven't really seen their impact yet. These include blockchain, vertical farming, autonomous vehicles, collaborative smart robotics, additive manufacturing, hyperloop transformation. All of these created lots of viral videos and lots of attention in the first phase, but most people have kind of gone meh because they haven't actually seen it in their day-to-day life, and it hasn't really impacted the way that we do things. But that doesn't mean it's not going to. This is where it's going to materialize in the second phase. And some things like additive manufacturing, the real driver is around phase one is simply, does it reduce cost? It's a very myopic mindset that businesses take. So in industries like pharmaceuticals, where additive is actually cheaper than normal methods, it was widely adopted. However, in FMCG, automotive, food production, additive is much more expensive. Therefore, there is very limited adoption. But the real benefit of additive will come in the second phase, not just when we get more advancements in additive manufacturing itself, but when it starts to become converging with other technologies like laser welding, robotics, artificial intelligence. And people use that technology not just to do what we've always done, but more efficiently, but actually to completely rethink the entire product or the entire value proposition and redesign it in new ways. So if you remember, I said each wave was sort of predicated around advancements in power, communications, and transformation. So you can see how this phase one, phase two is we're going to really work here. So in phase one, the improvements we saw in power generation was probably mostly around renewables and solar. But neither of those technologies are new. We've had windmills for centuries and solar's been around for decades. The only real benefit that's happened has been an efficiency improvement, specifically around solar, the ability to generate more power from solar panels at a cheaper price, a sort of Moore's law effect on solar. However, the second phase is a whole host of technologies which will be game-changing, everything from small modular nuclear reactions to nuclear fusion, so moving from fission to fusion. Where I work at the moment, MTC, we've worked on initiatives for capturing solar energy out in space and beaming it down to the Earth. So there's a whole host of technologies which will create completely clean energy, and that will cause a major geopolitical upset, because suddenly we'll be able to get unlimited energy for a very small amount of cost, which will change the price of products across the entire spectrum of industries. Communication is probably one area where we did see a bit of revolution in phase one. The device I'm talking to you right now, using Zoom or Teams or those sorts of technologies, got a real accelerant around COVID time, because obviously without this, we would have been really stuck, and most factories and places of work would have had to shut down. But the real transformation is going to happen when we see technologies like the Internet of Everything, which is converging to create digital twins of factories, of entire supply chains, augmented reality, holographic representation. All of these technologies will completely revitalize the way we do business, the understanding of the end-to-end supply chain. That will peel back layers and create visibility where we've never had before. Will remove the need for people to have decades of experience to understand how to maintain things, because instructions will be sort of placed right in front of your eyes, for example. So these are really transformative technologies. And the same goes for transportation. So the real revolution in phase one was electric vehicles, but electric vehicles have been around as long as the industrial combustion engine. They've just lacked the infrastructure to make them scalable. So what happened in the first phase? Well, of course, Elon Musk and his Tesla cars basically made electric cool. He created an infrastructure of charging stations which made them viable, but they were the same cars on the same roads with the same human driver and the same number of passengers. It's not really revolutionary, it's just more of an efficiency saving. However, in phase two, when autonomy becomes realized, and we're very, very close to that right now, you're going to see real revolutions in public transport, in sea transportation, air transportation, road transportation, major projects like Cargo Souterrain, which is going through the Swiss mountains, where we're taking all freight off the roads and putting them on maglev systems underneath the mountains. That will be revolutionary. It will free up our roads and really make transportation a much lower cost in the supply chain. So what we're doing is we're seeing these technologies coming together, and they're creating what I call a automation triple whammy. Whammy number one is the automation of muscle to machine, so the automation of physical tasks. Whammy number two is the thing that has most people spooked. So this is the automation of cerebral tasks, the use of predominantly artificial intelligence, and the automation of knowledge worker activities. And then whammy number three is machine brains basically driving machine hands, and the automation of the end-to-end supply chain. And these are going to be transformative, but only for those organizations who have created the environment whereby they can take advantage of these technologies in a way beyond just phase one thinking and just on focusing on efficiency. One of the technologies that's very interesting that's coming out at the moment is humanoid robotics, for example. So we've seen lots and lots of viral videos about humanoid robots in phase one, but we don't see them in our day-to-day lives. We don't see them in our factories. But right now they're getting ready for work. So we're getting very close to the point where we'll be able to hire humanoid robotic labor as a service. And this market is going to be exponential in both size and value, valued by the trillion by the time we get to sort of a decade's time. And the really interesting thing on this particular paper was, which I researched, was they said that the adoption curve of humanoid robots is mirroring that of early automobiles. So if you go back to that image I showed of New York and Fifth Avenue, it only took 5 years to move from a world of just horsepower to, motorized horsepower, effectively. So what happens in 5 years? We go from concept robotics to them working in our, factories and in our warehouses. And the reality is it probably won't be 5 years because they're already started. So companies like Figure, for example, have been working with BMW, putting them to work in their factories, and they're seeing massive improvements in reliability and in efficiency. They've also, because they're general purpose, because they're adopted to handle a human-sized world, they're now working with companies like UPS to see if they can work in logistics. And these are all areas that still employ large numbers of humans to do relatively repetitive tasks. And these are sort of perfectly suited for these kind of robotics. Now, the thing that's actually improving the speed of progression in that area is not so much the hardware and the sort of haptic technologies, but the intelligence, the artificial intelligence that's driving it. And one of the things that got most people spooked was the fact that the first industries to feel the effect of artificial intelligence were the ones we least expected. So we kind of expected, industries that were very human in nature, marketing, creative industries, those sorts of things, to be the ones that would be the most immune from automation. And what we've actually found is that they were the first ones impacted, for everything from the ability to write books and articles through to the ability to generate images, create videos, or even create music. However, just because we've got artificial intelligence, if we're using human stupidity to apply it, then you get situations like this, where people are using it to generate outcomes and then just pasting it rather than actually thinking about what you're doing. So this example here, where someone has obviously written a newspaper article via ChatGPT, but then left the prompt at the end from ChatGPT in the actual printed article. And one of the things we've seen at the moment is something that's quite worrying. As we've embraced things like social media, for example, our attention spans has reduced. And there was something called the reverse Flynn effect. The Flynn effect was a notable trend that went throughout the 20th century, the average human IQ increased. And certainly since the early 2000s, pretty much since the time we started moving towards smartphones and social media, there's been a noticeable decrease in average intelligence. So as we're investing trillions of pounds in increasing artificial intelligence, we really need to be spending quite a significant amount of money on ensuring that our human intelligence increases in order to be able to match and utilize that capability. And what we're finding right now, of course, is that AI is still at its very early stages. It's still very much in phase one, and it suffers from the sort of Dunning-Kruger effect, where its confidence is much greater than its credibility. The cartoon there that kind of shows the examples. And I've spent a bit of time working with agents, AI, and doing a lot of work with agentic AI. And sometimes you get very frustrated that, the AI is telling you something with great confidence is correct, and it's not correct, and you're having to then test it again, and it's going, oh, you're absolutely right, I'm wrong. And well, why were you wrong? Why did you make that mistake? Now, but we're on an exponential improvement curve with AI, and certainly LLMs, large language models at the moment, are improving at an exponential rate. So these issues will minimize as we move further and further up the sort of exponential curve. Now, why do we need artificial intelligence anyway, specifically in the supply chain? Well, one of the major reasons is that, in this very fast-paced digital world, what we're finding is that sort of consumer expectations are becoming too demanding. These black swans have gone from rare to bloody everywhere, so they're becoming far too common. Human employees are too slow to handle the sort of data volume, velocity, variability, and variety of data that hits them on a day-to-day basis. Our traditional forecasting models are too accurate. Our planning cycles are too infrequent, at too high a level. Long tail in most businesses are far too long, and too complex. Our past experiences and human biases are too embedded. And our legacy systems are simply too disconnected, and trying to bring the data together across those different platforms is proving too difficult. Now, in order to adapt to the world we live in right now, we need supply chains that can basically, handle these sort of data volumes in real time, all the time. And this is kind of where AI is coming to the rescue, and we're seeing the sort of dawn of what I call the sort of self-driving, self-correcting supply chain. There are 4 levels to this. The first level is not particularly useful, but it helps us to get to the root cause of issue. And I like to use the analogy of sort of driving and GPS systems. So it's kind of like it's like a car that's telling you you're stuck in traffic when you're already stuck in traffic. So it might be able to tell you why you're in that situation, but it hasn't helped you get out of it. So it's if you imagine you have an issue in your supply chain, it's able to tell you why you had that issue, what was the root cause, but you still had the issue. Level 2 becomes a bit more helpful. It's starting to tell you that there are likely issues ahead, but it doesn't tell you what to do about them. Level 3 is where we're at with sort of GPS systems right now, and this has become particularly helpful now. So now we're into sort of a world of prescriptive proposals where it's able to see the issue in your supply chain, identify what the issue is, come up with alternative solutions, and tell you what the impact of those solutions would be. A bit like your GPS says, look, I think there's an issue on the motorway. Here's 3 options about how you want to get home. We can go, avoid toll roads, go the low carbon route, whatever. And this is the time each one of those will get you home. And then the 4th level is basically the self-driving supply chain. So this is the sort of autonomous car that wakes you up when you're home and then tells you there was a few issues, but it rerouted it and we were asleep, so it just left you alone. So level 1 and 2 is effectively decision support. This is helping make decisions using data from machines. Level 3 is decision augmentation. So it's helping humans to make decisions using recommendations from machines. And level 4 is decision automation. So this is machines making the decisions, acting autonomously and learning from the experience. So this is humans in the loop, humans on the loop, and then humans out of the loop. And the sort of technology that's driving level 4 is sort of this, what's called agentic AI or decision intelligence. Now, the real promise of agentic AI is the ability to connect decisions across the end-to-end supply chain with understanding of their impact on other decisions in other areas, whether or not that's decisions across the supply chain, then understanding their financial impact, which is then being used to drive changes potentially in marketing plans or sales activities. So that ability to have connected decisions that said, well, if I change the mode of transport on an incoming shipment from air to freight, what's that do to my lead time? What does it do to my carbon or my scope 3 emissions? What does that do to my costs? What's the bill of materials that's waiting for these raw components? What finished products are they making? What customer orders do I have waiting? And is this going to cause me an impact if I change the mode of transport? So it's looking all the way across the supply chain, using data to make real-time decisions that previously would have involved a lot of people getting in a room, maybe across continents, in order to make that kind of decision. So we're approaching something called what I call there's the SADL AI agents, so agents that sense, analyze, decide, act, and learn. So they sense changes in external information, which could be a change in exchange rate, a commodity price rise, or some tariff being applied, which are very relevant right now, as you know. Maybe some adverse weather, some geopolitical unrests, and then it comes up with responses, recommendations, alternatives, and actions, and maybe the ability to automatically respond, which could be to reprioritize fulfillment, consolidate some shipments, stockpile key raw materials, etc. And of course, the quality of the decision making is very much dependent on the quality of the data used to make that decision. How frequently it receives that information, the speed of that information being received, the accuracy and the granularity. There's no good getting information at a family group level. You really need it at the very sort of lowest sort of skew location level. The potential of this, however, is enormous. It moves us from a world where businesses are based on just individuals and their own knowledge and biases into actually having a connective, collective organizational memory where we record decision-making and their outcomes, and it learns over time and shares that learning across the organization. Now, one of the things I've learned over my sort of 30 years is that people don't trust numbers unless they understand where those numbers come from. So the idea of having a sort of black box situation where we simply just spit out a number and the business runs to it is something that most people are very nervous of. And even if the system sort of says, just trust me, we're not going to, we're going to actually want to see sort of where you got that information from. So people want glass box solutions where they can actually understand how the calculations were made. But that's for now. As the volume, the variety, and the velocity of data increases, and we begin to trust the machines and their outputs, people and businesses will continuously start to pass decision making over to them. So we end up with much more autonomous supply chains. And to be honest, we haven't really seen anything yet, because one of the technologies that's been worked on in phase one that is going to emerge in phase two is quantum computing. And the big area for quantum is supply chains, because they're enormously complicated. They involve a multitude of moving parts, lots of vehicle movements and logistical transactions taking place, on a minute basis. So quantum is the target area. Sorry, logistics is the target area for quantum. And to give you an idea of the speed of change and technological advancement in quantum, I'd like to compare Moore's law, which is, as you probably know, is based around the fact that the processing power of transistor chips sort of doubles every 18 months, but they cost halves. And that's what's driven the entire computer age and the sixth wave to date. And Nevin's law, and this is based after Harmut Nevin, who was a leader of quantum at Google. This is exponential. So this is the sort of classic computing power. This is what has enabled the device you have in your hands or in your pockets to be exponentially more powerful than what got us to the moon. And this is Nevin's law. So this is the rate of progress, or double exponential, we're seeing in quantum computing power. And there is a race for quantum supremacy on at the moment between companies, but also between countries, because obviously quantum computing will be able to do certain things which are quite scary. They would probably be able to, crack cybersecurity, for example. So there are lots of races going on both between companies and between countries to be first. So all of this technology is all coming together to lead to what I call the PAL supply chain: personalized product, services, and experience, automated delivery and planning, and local production, logistics, and retail. And when I sort of talked about this back in the early 2010s, I've been talking about the sort of PAL supply chain for quite a while now. Most people go, yeah, I kind of get the personalized bit. You've just shown me lots of videos about automation. I get that. I'm not with you on the local bit. No one says that anymore, because obviously what we're seeing ever since COVID is, that the outsourcing and outshoring of most of our supply chains has exposed us to exponential levels of risk. So we've got lots of companies that are sort of starting to nearshore and reshore their supply chains at the moment. And that's quite good, because obviously the shorter the supply chain, the stronger the supply chain, we can make only to the demand signal and don't have to, hold huge amounts of inventory, and we just move them small distances. So I'll hope you'll agree that the future's looking nothing like the past. And the quite concerning message, I think, for a lot of people who are really struggling with the rate of change at the moment is that things are never again going to be as slow as they are right now. The trouble is that most organizations are fragile and really struggling to handle this pace of change. And the reason why, generally, is we're still stuck in very industrial age mindsets with very linear thinking in what is now an exponential world. And I quite like Gary Hamel's quote here that says, right now, your company has 21st century internet-enabled business processes, mid-20th century management processes, all built atop 19th century management principles. And as I'm sure you agree, that's pretty much correct. That is most businesses most of the time. And actually, if we look at the West, we're really struggling right now in terms of, if we look at artificial intelligence. Certainly there's huge amounts of innovation coming out of China and America in this space. And we tend to, in Europe and the UK, our innovation seems to be new ways to develop bottle tops. So, I think the saying always goes that sort of, America innovates, China imitates, and Europe regulates. Well, I don't think that's true anymore. I think China is actually innovating more so than the West. And in fact, if you look at the adoption of industrial robots, you can see that there's more robots being installed in China every year than the rest of the world combined. And we have, certainly in the downswing phase and the early stage phase, been focused very myopically, as I mentioned, on cost control. And that drove us to sort of offshore most of our key assets, which is our manufacturing capability. So certainly in the UK, we kind of hollowed out our industrial base and our manufacturing industry. And that's been a fatal mistake. And you can see from these headlines here, all from the Harvard Business Review, how people have gone, China can't innovate. Well, China has a bit of an advantage around innovation too. Actually, we can't keep up with the rate of China's innovation, all within a decade. So, we've made a really fatal mistake here, and the sort of what I call the sort of world's most overdue reality check is that those countries that make innovate, and those countries that don't Well, they don't. And this headline from last, I think it was earlier this month, actually, it might have been, really struck home, where a lot of the car executives from Ford and organizations went out to see the Chinese car manufacturers like Zeekr and came back absolutely terrified. Ford's chief executive there saying it's the most humbling thing I've ever seen. They've realized they're not a couple of years behind. They now feel like they're decades behind, and they quite simply can't compete. So I guess the question is why? Why are Western companies struggling to adapt? And, doesn't really matter what industry sector I go into, I see the same sort of issues. The first one is we have incredibly short-term industrial mindset. So we're still, certainly if you're a public organization, sort of looking at the next quarter, keeping our focus on basically trying to maximize profit, which is leading very much to sort of silo thinking within organizations. We still have sales and marketing and manufacturing and the departmental structures that don't really gel together. We don't have this sort of end-to-end value chain thinking. When they're looking at digitization, we're looking at digitization of existing processes, and sort of that stifles any sort of level of critical thinking. And also, rather than being sort of outside in and looking very customer centric, we're still very inside in and thinking about how us as a firm can make things generally more efficient in terms of our activities rather than more effective. So if you look at supply chain as a 4D chess game, which it effectively is, we need to really make thousands of daily decisions on multiple variables. We need to align our strategy all the way down to execution across the end-to-end supply chain. But in order to do that, we need to understand the supply chain strategy, its performance metrics, its network, its processes, systems, and resources. And then we need to be able to sort of codify the strategic trade-off of decisions. Are we focusing on this particular segment on low carbon over low cost? Is it sustainability more important than speed? Is agility more important than lean? And the reality is, in most businesses, they don't know. They kind of average everything. And on average, things are okay. But, as Jeff Bezos once said, don't do averages. And then, a long time of the decisions, we really need to have a strategic playbook that includes mitigation tactics and contingency plans in the event of one of these black swan emerging. And the reality is, of course, most organizations are playing 1D chess on a single plane and only really looking at the adjacent moves. I even say in my own organization, it would really help if we can think more than one chess move ahead. It's a challenge for most organizations, this sort of, act and react mindset. Most of the moves are functional and operational. They're not strategic and not end-to-end. They don't see the end-to-end game. They're only ever thinking one move ahead, and the trade-offs and wider implications of any decision we make are not understood. And that's why we find in most organizations, the sort of best firefighters are also their biggest arsonists. We're solving today's issues by stealing tomorrow. But Sean, I hear you say, we've spent a fortune on technology. Why hasn't that made things easier? Well, that's because most of them, technological programs that most people have, most of their digital transformations, have really failed to deliver any sustainable return on investment. In fact, I particularly like this statistic from Gartner, who said that when they surveyed a whole host of different organizations, 60+% of them said they had plans to invest in intelligent automation, but the same level, 60+% said they're not prepared for intelligent automation. So they're grasping at the technology, knowing that they're not going to be able to make any value out of it because they're just not organizationally structured in order to be able to do that. And the problem and the reason for that is that most companies still operating with an analog industrial mindset. It's more about mindset than it is sort of management processes or machines. So when they take on board all of this digital transformation, they're really looking at digitizing existing inefficient processes, workflows, and ways of working, rather than stepping back and transforming the way the business operates and redefining the way they work. In fact, this survey that came out last week from IBM kind of highlights this, and it said Chief Digital Officer said a focus on short-term performance is the top barrier to innovation. No one's thinking big, no one's thinking beyond the next quarter. Everyone's expecting an immediate return on investment, which means it's really narrowing their focus and minimizing the impact they can get from these technologies. So what we're seeing is the two most common approaches to digital AI transformation is either replicating what we've always done using some new digital tool, or just imitating, what others are doing just in order to be able to keep up. And this cartoon I quite liked. It came out sort of a week or so, I think it was a month ago, to be fair. I saw this and I thought this just kind of sums up, the sort of drive to AI. So we want AI. What do we want it to do? We don't know. But when do we need it? Now, because we feel like we're going to be left behind. But we don't actually know how it's going to help us, our business, or our customers. We just know that everyone else is using AI, so we're just embracing it as well. And if we look at how AI is being used right now, well, it's being used, as I mentioned, as an efficiency saving. So the area that's being impacted most by the advancements in AI tools like, ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, etc., is graduates. So all of the what is not particularly glamorously called sort of grudge work, the introductory work as you bring young people into the organization, is what businesses are looking at. So how can we just automate that? So it's graduates and those entry-level jobs that are feeling the real impact. And that's not to do with the technology, it has to do with the mindset of the organization only being able to look at where it can simply save costs rather than thinking bigger. Well, you might say, well, we've captured all this new data, Sean. Isn't that helping? Well, in fact, actually, if you look at the statistics, and it's actually making things more difficult, not less. In this state-of-the-art decision-making report found that the biggest challenge for CEOs is that actually they have too much data and not enough time to do anything with that data. And in fact, when they actually use that data, what they tend to do is use the data in the same way a drunk uses a lamppost, which is more for support than illumination, i.e. they cherry pick bits of information that corresponds with the decisions or their mindset that already exists, rather than becoming truly data driven and saying, what does the data tell us? They're not interested in what the data tells them. They're just looking for data that corresponds with what they already believe. And many companies, therefore, are data rich but insights poor. They've basically created a data lake to store all of their data, but they've got a bit of a bitter pill to swallow, which means just because you've given a home for all your data doesn't mean it solves your bad data problems. It's just given it somewhere to live. And if we want to build this new world of artificial intelligence, well, ultimately, it has to be based on accurate information. And what we find right now is in most businesses, that information is actually stored on some Excel spreadsheets. And that's the sort of the information that's underpinning your sort of AI journey. And again, going back to that report I showed earlier, it seems that 26% of chief digital officers are confident in their data capabilities. So 3/4 basically do not believe the data they have in there can actually support their journey to be driving AI-enabled revenue streams. And 82% say they're wasting data if employees can't access it, mainly because it's on Excel spreadsheets. Now, you might remember that data science used to be the career choice that everyone was talking about 3 or 4 years ago. Well, actually, now what we're finding is that most of data science is doing data hygiene. And in fact, data scientists are now quitting their jobs in enormous numbers because simply they didn't sign up to do data hygiene. They signed up to do data science, but they're not able to do any data science because the data is not clean enough. So really what they need to do is to kind of move from being sort of what I call sort of moving from data driven to decision driven. So at the moment, data scientists are looking at a huge pool of data and business leaders are expecting them to come up with insights, but the data scientists themselves don't know what they're looking for. Whereas what we actually really need is the business leaders to be clear about what outcomes they want to achieve, what decisions impact their outcomes, so that the data scientists can narrow the focus down onto those decisions and then widen their focus outside of the organization to look at external data sources as well as internal ones in order to be able to create better decisions that drive better outcomes. So the question I have to all of you to think about really is, are you digitizing your current business? Or are you using digital to create your future one? So, I use the line, digital transformation isn't really a journey, it's a journey, not a destination. And you shouldn't try and do digital. Your challenge is to become digital. Now, a lot of companies have been talking about resilience, and this has been the sort of key word for a long time now. And I'd like to sort of leave the sort of premise that it's not enough, really, because resilience requires going back to a previous state undamaged. But in a time of exponential change, it's not sufficient to simply go back to a previous state because that doesn't exist anymore. And in fact, what we need to do is continuously evolve to keep up with the pace of change. So I'll use 2 examples very, very quickly. If Blockbuster had focused on creating real resilience in its supply chain, or Kodak had created resilience in its film process and supply chain, they still would have both been replaced by Netflix and Instagram. Their mindset and their business model was based around something that wasn't relevant anymore in the world of Blockbuster physical stores and in Kodak, standard film. Digital had taken over, but they were primarily positioned to basically take advantage of that. Blockbuster had the opportunity to acquire Netflix for 50 million, laughed them out of the building. Kodak invented the digital camera, decided not to do anything. Neither of these two now play a part in the future of technology, because both of them are now no longer. And if we look at uncertainty, we find that most businesses, 63%, experience a loss, 28% are quite resilient and have no loss or gain. But 9%, and these are the 9% I'm interested in, actually gain from uncertainty. So these are what we call sort of anti-fragile organizations. And I'm really interested in what they are doing, and so should you be. And the reason why it's interesting is that in these times of massive disruption and high fragility, they create real opportunities. So I like Ayrton Senna's quote here that says, you can't overtake 15 cars in sunny weather, but you can when it's raining. And it's raining right now. So this is a great opportunity to be able to overtake your competitors. The way to do that is to move towards anti-fragile. So for fragile organizations are kind of I-shaped people in I-shaped organizations, where the primary focus is on increasing operational efficiency. Resilient organizations are T-shaped people in T-shaped teams. So this is people who look across the end-to-end supply chain, are able to maximize effectiveness and flow across the chain. Anti-fragile are ones where it's what I call X-shaped people in X-shaped value networks, where the focus is creating more value from customers and stakeholders. So here, these organizations hate uncertainty. They cause disruption and post-traumatic stress. These organizations manage uncertainty, so they're able to create an effective response. And these ones here love uncertainty. They result in learning and post-traumatic growth rather than post-traumatic stress. So in this next phase, fragile companies are going to struggle, resilient will survive, and the anti-fragile will thrive. So fragile companies are generally component thinkers. Their mindset's very narrow. The span of control is just a function. They're very good at reacting to problems and very good chaos managers, and their focus is on efficiency. Resilient organizations, and I do apologize for the text overlapping, I don't know why that's happening. End to end, the span of control is supply chain, and the objective is to overcome challenges and become more effective. And the exponential thinkers here, are looking across the business model, exploiting opportunities, and really focusing on experimentation. So I'd like to use an analogy if I can. Fragile companies aren't like bone china. You don't drop them and they break. Things in fragile companies tend to flow, but they flow, in a very viscous kind of way. However, if you have any sort of disruptive pressure applied to them, they stiffen up. The functions basically stop collaborating, stop communicating. Resilient organizations are like Da Vinci bridges. You place pressure on them and they support each other, but when the pressure's relaxed, they just still a bridge there. And then anti-fragile companies basically operate like human muscular systems. You put them under stress, you create trauma, but the next time they're able to respond to that stress, much more easily than before. So if we look at the different ways they handle the AI challenge, fragile companies will look at it as a tool to survive. So again, they're looking, like I talked about with the graduates, they're saying, wait, where can I reduce some costs? How can I reduce my FTEs? Resilient companies are looking at efficiency and process optimization across the supply chain. And anti-fragile companies are using AI as a way of reimagining their business models and to create differentiation in their value proposition, or to create new revenue generating ideas. So it's as an opportunity to create completely new opportunities. The impact, therefore, and if you use Amara's law, is not simply to try and do what we've always done using these new tools and to think about what we can automate, but to ask ourselves, what if? Because, the light bulb didn't emerge because we did continuous improvement activities on the candle, and the motor car didn't come out because we did projects to improve the horse. They came from new thinking. And what we need now to understand is that tools are never enough. So to maximize the potential of all this new hardware and software, what we actually need is new thoughtware, a creation of a corporate mindset and a series of cognitive skills that provide the ability to consistently adapt to technological and social change. So the culture that needs to exist in your organization is a culture of both what I call grit and growth, so a clarity of focus that provides resilience, but then the ability to exponentially learn and experiment and learn from that experimentation. And then within that, the ability for individuals to develop and work on 5 cognitive skills: critical thinking, systems thinking, design thinking, creative thinking, and circular thinking. And it's the intersection between these cognitive skills, your anti-fragility, and the real benefit comes out that will protect your organization from this sort of onslaught of technological change, because it allows you to look at it in different ways. So you become a learning organization where critical thinking involves assessing information objectively to make informed decisions, such as, who's the customer and what do they value. Systems thinking focus on recognizing and understanding relationships within complex systems, i.e. the supply chain. Design thinking allows you to put yourselves in the shoes of the customer and understand their needs and frustrations. Creative thinking helps you look at all of this innovation like artificial intelligence or robotics or additive and think, how does it help us to create new possibilities for creating value? And then, circular thinking enables you to actually think about how you reimagine your supply chain in order to become more sustainable, or to deliver, more sustainable propositions that help your customer to become more sustainable. And it's the intersections between those which where real value lies. So it helps you to move from a world of chaos into a world of control, and which ultimately leads to improvement. So we use those skills together. You see that critical thinking, systems thinking, design thinking, creative thinking, circular thinking together will help you to create understanding and control of your supply chains. And then once you have that, it helps you go for that second stage to sort of grow through evolution. So the same intersection of skills are just used in slightly different ways. And the first thing, to understand root causes of issues and how we should operate together to create control. And the second time, how to create exponential change. And the good news for all of you is that all of those skills and all of those mindsets can be developed. Grit can be developed through developing a unified purpose. Growth mindsets can be encouraged and rewarded within your organization. And these cognitive skills can be taught, and once taught, they can be applied. And what we need right now is digital skills for the digital way, because in our machine world, our uniquely human skills will become more important. The old jobs that were structured, repeatable, rule-based, predictable, dull, dirty, dangerous, they're all going to be replaced. There is no doubt about that. But a whole raft of new jobs that are much more uniquely human will emerge based on critical thinking, design thinking, creativity, understanding, empathy, inquiry, etc. Problem solving, team building. These are the jobs of the future. So we've got to move from a world where just our previous experience and knowledge determines our value, to where our ability to ask the right questions, see beyond the obvious, and use a mix of data, imagining, and creativity to deliver new solutions determines your worth. And what we're seeing already is all those businesses that in the very myopic mindset have just gone and laid off all those people in order to use AI have now regretted that decision. They've realized what the human talent that they've just let go is actually what they need in order to move forward and take advantage of all these new technological tools. So there's a massive sense of regret going for organizations that acted with haste and with very myopic cost control mindset. So take this opportunity, all this disruption, because, as Roosevelt said, a smooth sea never made a skilled sailor, because the rate of change isn't going to slow down. Things are not going to get easier. Industrial companies are not going to make it, but there is a way you can learn not to survive, but to thrive. And that's from becoming anti-fragile. So leave you with this message. Things are never again going to be as slow as they are right now, but this next phase gives you a real opportunity to redefine what your company stands for, how it operates, and what it rewards. And I urge you to take it. Thank you very much.